By the time we started settling into the 5th console generation, 16-bit consoles had already perfected 2D platformers and RPGs and began exploring 3D territory. As the PlayStation and, to a lesser extent, Sega Saturn started to phase out the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, developers started pushing their existing franchises into 3D as well. Sometimes for the best, and sometimes...
of them in each level, and if you get enough of them...
But Bubsy was always terrible, so who cares?
What could possibly go wrong?
Anyway, this is CrashLove Gaming's top 5 best and top 5 worst jumps to 3D, and joining me on this roller coaster of quality is Wolfkaosaun.
Final Fight was one of those old-fashioned arcade games that you could play for hours on end. It also had one of the most recognizable and iconic beat-em-up characters in Poison. My favorite part though is you can be the former mayor who's like super jacked and just beat the crap out of everybody. That had a lot of charm to me. Final Fight had some simple, fun, and challenging games. With most beat-em-up games, however, the transition to 3D is a very tough jump that very few have successfully accomplished. Now, there was a fighting game spin-off, but I never played it, so I'm not going to count that, can't really talk about it. Instead, let's talk about the abysmal Final Fight Streetwise. Have you ever seen Fight Club? Yeah? Well, imagine that in a game, but way worse. I wish this was a joke, but it's literally Fight Club in the beginning of the game. You know what every single 3D beat-em-up game truly needs that this game brought? Stomping on cockroaches and rats. Yeah, that's a joke. While you can upgrade combos, you really won't need to in this game. Just button mash your attack and you win. Yeah, whoop-de-doo. Oh, and they somehow ruined the original arcade Final Fight. They couldn't even get the bonus right. I'm hoping for a good game in the recently announced Final Fight 4. But beat-em-ups have had a lot of trouble in the 3D department, so I'm gonna be a little cautious with my expectations.
Oh my god!
1994's Super Metroid is often considered one of, if not the best game on the Super Nintendo. The jump from Return of Samus to Super Metroid is one of the best we've seen in a sequel. The controls, while maybe not as tight as Super Mario World, take full advantage of the Super Nintendo's additional buttons and does not tell you how to use them. There are items that can only be obtained by using the Shine Spark, and not even the instruction manual tells you how to do that. But this game is all about exploration and learning without explicitly being told what to do. Just watch how the game teaches you how to wall jump. And this is back when wall jumping wasn't super common either. We wouldn't get another Metroid game for 8 years, but it was definitely worth the wait. In another massive leap, Metroid Prime on the GameCube took everything that made the franchise what it is and turned it into a first-person adventure game. It's got the exploration, upgrades, the feeling of isolation, and the story is told through the ability to scan your surroundings in a few short cutscenes. The larger scope of these games allowed Retro and Nintendo to further explore the lore of the Metroid universe, introduce new characters, and dive deeper into previously established concepts. Team Ninja would later take 3D Metroid in another direction with Other M, and while it isn't as popular as the Prime series, it plays much more closely to the 2D entries in the series. Other M seems like it would actually be the most logical next step after Super Metroid in terms of gameplay, but Prime does a much better job of making you feel alone in an unfamiliar and hostile environment. And it doesn't have this.
The baby, and the baby, or the baby, of the baby, or the baby. Babies cry.
This one just straight up hurts me, as Golden Axe was one of my favorite games to play on the Sega Genesis. Just jump on a dragon and burn people, it's a grand old time! It was another series that you could play in the arcade and also had a home console release. And then they released this mess of a game in 2008 called Golden Axe Beast Rider. Just like Final Fight, the combat is underwhelming and can be done by just mashing the attack button, as every button is essentially doing the same amount of damage. Honestly, the game has little to nothing to do with the original games. It feels as if they just threw Golden Axe to make money. Actually, I'm 99% sure that's exactly what they did. As the title suggests, you can ride beasts. And while the beasts themselves are unique in their own way, it's actually not fun at all. The hitboxes are wacky and the controls are meh, for lack of a better term. You can get knocked off pretty easily. When the main pull of your game fails, you know you made a mistake. It's actually pretty crazy how different Metal Gear is from its 2D self. When it comes to the original 2D Metal Gear games, you can see how much the game improved upon while jumping to 3D. Many staples such as the exclamation points, the top-down view, and working your way up through weapons are seen through the earliest Metal Gear games. You can even see an improvement between the first and second Metal Gear 2D games. Starting with Metal Gear Solid, it created a staple in not only stealth-driven gameplay, but storytelling. Albeit some cryptic and confusing storytelling at times, but it grew to become one of the greatest franchises of all time. The visuals improved the suspense of stealth and trying to figure out how to get around enemies. The interactions between characters and growing attached to multiple characters, both good and evil, it just created so much for me. It allows you to see the viewpoints from the other side. It also had some of the most memorable boss battles. No one's ever going to forget having to put the controller in the second port to be Psycho Mantis, because that's a minute in history. I could literally write a book about my love for the Metal Gear franchise. But no one wants to sit here for an hour and hear about me babble about how great it is. So long story short, Metal Gear's jump to 3D was one of the best.
It's like one of my Japanese animes.
I don't know why I keep baiting the Sonic fandom, but I do know that the jump to 3D was not good for Sonic the Hedgehog. Sure, it didn't always turn out bad, but I can count the good 3D Sonics on one hand while I need a dumpster to hold all the bad ones. The Genesis Trilogy and a third are classics that defined the early 90s and stood toe-to-toe with the king of 2D platforming. Then they made an isometric 3D collectathon that everyone hated. Then they made one of the worst racing games of history. Sonic Jam was the first time we got to freely control Sonic in a truly 3D space, and it wasn't that bad. Of course, it was basically just a way to select one of the Genesis games, but that taste of 3D gave us hope that the Saturn wasn't a waste of money. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case, and the first full-length 3D Sonic game wouldn't come out until 1998 Sonic Adventure. And it was cool, I guess. At the time, the two Sonic adventures felt great. Rolling around at the speed of sound, voice acting, playing as different characters, it was what we always wanted. But it doesn't really hold up as well as other 3D games at the time.
Oh no, oh no, oh no.
And it just went downhill from there. The most recent nail in 3D Sonic's coffin was how well Sonic Mania, a true return to 2D and a game not even developed by Sega, was received in contrast to Sonic Team's own Sonic Forces. Let's hope for the next one they either get it right or give it up.
The first Grand Theft Auto game I ever played was actually the first one. It had that T rating, so my parents bought it for me. But you never forget that Christmas dinner playing Grand Theft Auto and hearing and your mom coming from the TV, and neither do your parents. They took that game back the next day. It was pretty mindless fun. You could do tasks by going to telephones and doing these missions, but mostly the fun was walking around and destroying everything you can. Of course, this game had its controversy, but let's actually talk about the game. The controls could have been better and it looked pretty bland for a PlayStation game. The jump to 3D, however, included more controversy, more destruction, more character, more freedom, and a ton more fun. With each installment getting better and better, it's no wonder why Grand Theft Auto 5 is the third best selling video game of all time. The series continued to evolve, build, and give what the players wanted. I mean, do you know how awesome the DLC in Grand Theft Auto 5 that's free? There's a lot that they continue to add to the online mode, and it just keeps players coming back. I can't tell you how many times I've reinstalled this game because of just the new stuff that they add.
The original Castlevania is an expertly crafted but very difficult gaming experience. In the 80s there weren't very many ways to convey horror, unlike today where it's severely overdone, but Konami sure tried. The visuals are a throwback to classic monster movies, the music is some of the best on the NES, and everything the game does mechanically is deliberate. This isn't Mario where you can just bolt through the level jumping over pits and enemies. Simon is slow, and so is his main attack, the Vampire Killer Whip. The enemies are placed in such a way that you always need to be aware of your surroundings. The second game,
This game sucks.
had some good music. After going back to the style of the original and Dracula's Curse, the series moved into the 16-bit era with Super Castlevania 4. It basically took all the best aspects of the first game and made them even better. Simon was faster, he'd whip in all directions, he could dangle from hooks, he could do whatever this is. With this game and the Japanese only release of Rondo of Blood, classic Castlevania reached its peak. How would anything be able to top these two games? That's when Koji Igarashi released his masterpiece, Symphony of the Night. A game so good a new genre was created to describe it. Now you're playing as Alucard, son of Dracula. He's fast, he can transform, level up, equip different items and weapons, and explore the entire castle twice. Then you can replay the entire game as Richter from Rondo of Blood. Also Maria Renard if you're playing the inferior Sega Saturn version. But this game was so good, all future 2D Castlevania games would follow this formula. But what about the follow-up? Well, 2 years after Symphony, Konami released Castlevania 64, the series' first attempt at a 3D entry. It was, Pretty awful. They tried to fix it by releasing a prequel/remake the same year with Castlevania Legacy of Darkness, but it was somehow even worse. I might understand if 3D games were a new thing, but the Nintendo 64 had been on the market for 3 years at this point. The series went back to 2D for a while until Lament of Innocence in 2003. It was just okay. No matter what Konami did, the 3D Castlevania games just couldn't compare to the 2D Metroidvania entries being released on the Game Boy Advance and the DS. The Castlevania gameplay that had been the backbone of the series for over a decade just didn't translate well to 3D, so they eventually just turned it into God of War. It's unclear where the series will go from here with Konami's slow but steady self-destruction, but at least we're getting a lot of Castlevania content in the new Super Smash Bros. I've already talked a lot about The Legend of Zelda in a previous top 10, but in case you haven't touched a video game in the last 32 years, it's a pretty big deal. The first game was revolutionary. It's a very early open world adventure game giving you the freedom to do almost anything with very little direction. The sequel, not that one, put in place what we call the Zelda formula. Collect some things, get the Master Sword, collect more things, and fight the boss. Usually some form of Ganon. In 1998, Nintendo took this in the third dimension with a game that's often called the greatest of all time. Even if Ocarina was the only 3D Zelda to ever get released, I'd still put it on this list because of how well they were able to transition everything that made A Link to the Past a classic into 3D space. It's debatable whether or not the combat and puzzles actually improved when moving to 3D, but the atmosphere, storytelling, and scope of the games definitely got a boost. Majora's Mask has one of the most unnerving yet engaging stories in any Nintendo game. Wind Waker had a nearly endless ocean to explore. Twilight Princess was massive at the time and gave us a darker, more mature look at the world of Hyrule. Skyward Sword was a game. I'm kidding, I actually really like Skyward Sword. Great story and characters, even if the gameplay can be a little awkward. But fuck those Guardians. And Breath of the Wild is a massive open world where you can do pretty much anything you want. If you want a good example of how to turn a 2D game into a 3D game, compare A Link to the Past to Ocarina, or the original Legend of Zelda to Breath of the Wild.
This one hurts my heart. This was one of my favorite franchises when I was a kid, even though the games are hard as balls. It took me until I was 20 years old to beat Contra 3 Alien Wars. I had to beat it with a friend. So the original games were difficult with its aiming, precise jumping, and avoiding the brigade of gunfire towards you, throwing new elements at you, but you knew that you were able to beat it. It was a challenge, but you always got farther each time you played. But, alright, let's talk about the 3D jump. While Konami has released some more 2D Contra games, they've also done some big mess-ups. They have Contra 3D, a movie-like pachinko slot machine arcade game. Yeah, it's all luck, yay. Contra has had some up and down moments outside the trilogy, most of the good moments coming from their 2D games. But there's two major down moments: Contra Legacy of War and C, the Contra Adventure. With Legacy of War, the camera is your biggest enemy, along with frame rate pretty much crapping the bed every second it gets. It's not an awful jump from 2D to 3D, but it's also not a solid one. There's cheap deaths, and it's going to be hard to decipher what to do because it's hard to see what's coming at you. At least in the 2D series it felt fair because you saw it and you were punished for not dodging it. Then you have this sad excuse in C, the Contra Adventure. It tries to feed off the nostalgia of Contra by throwing in the 2D side-scrolling in the beginning, but that fades away quickly. The sound is some of the most awful and ill-placed I've ever heard in a game ever. That's serious. The camera is so slow that it feels unfair to move around in third person. Remember how I talked about the precise platforming in the earlier games? This ruins it as well! There are so many issues with this game. If you haven't heard about it, be glad, be thankful. Just stick with the 2D Contra games because the 3D ones are just subpar and awful.
Like it or not, Nintendo have always been trendsetters. It's actually kind of mind-boggling how one company can be so innovative, yet still behind the times in many ways. The Nintendo 64 launched in 1996 with Super Mario 64. Now, name one good 3D platformer released before that. You can't. Nintendo perfected the genre on their first try. One of the biggest problems 3D games had in the early days was the camera. Actually, that's a problem that still comes up today, but Mario 64 had that shit down. It didn't stay very true to the gameplay of Super Mario Bros. 3 or Super Mario World, but the way Nintendo handled their biggest franchise in 3D for the first time created an impact that is still felt in game development today. A lot of games from that era feel super wonky, but Mario 64 is as smooth as ever. It's not only this one game from 20 years ago, Super Mario Sunshine is another beloved 3D Mario, and the Galaxy games are some of the best from from the Wii S 360 generation. More recently, Super Mario Odyssey is like Mario 64 multiplied by every 3D Mario that came after it. If you do want an example of classic 2D Mario gameplay in 3D, check out Super Mario 3D Land, or with multiplayer 3D World. So those were our top 5 best and worst jumps from 2D to 3D. Huge thanks to Wolfkaosaun for being a part of this video. If you enjoyed the video, like it, subscribe, let us know what your picks are in the comments, follow me on social media at CrashLove Gaming, and check out Wolfkaosaun's channel by clicking the thing on the screen or the link in the description. Thanks for watching and we'll see you next time.